The night Marcus Coleman called me poor trash in front of 200 people at the Phoenix Industries annual gala, I walked out of that ballroom knowing my marriage was about to implode. What I didn't know was that his arrogance had just handed me the keys to destroy everything he'd built. My wife, Emma, stood there, champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips, watching her husband get publicly humiliated by her boss. She didn't defend me. She didn't walk out with me. She stayed. That silence told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay, and it lit a fire in me that would burn their entire world to the ground. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen. I'm 38 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was the kind of man people overlooked at parties. Not because I was unsuccessful, but because success in my world doesn't come with flash or headlines. I'm a software architect, the guy who builds the invisible backbone that keeps entire companies running. While others chase promotions and corner offices, I solve problems that would cripple businesses if they went unnoticed. I spent 15 years perfecting systems that handle millions of transactions daily, creating algorithms that save corporations hundreds of millions in efficiency gains. My work is the foundation everything else stands on, but nobody talks about foundations at cocktail parties. I came from modest beginnings in Sacramento, the son of a mechanic and a school teacher who taught me that real value comes from what you build, not what you buy. My parents saved every penny to send me to UC Berkeley for computer science, and I graduated debt-free thanks to their sacrifice and my late nights writing code for local businesses. I learned early that flashy displays of wealth meant nothing if the fundamentals were rotten. While my classmates chased startup dreams and venture capital, I focused on mastering the craft, becoming the person companies called when their systems were failing and millions were on the line. By 35, I had built something rare in Silicon Valley, a reputation for absolute reliability. When major corporations needed their most critical systems rebuilt, they called me. When financial institutions needed bulletproof security architecture, my name was at the top of the list. I wasn't making headlines or giving TED Talks, but I was making serious money, the kind that comes from being indispensable rather than famous. My bank account reflected 15 years of solving problems other people couldn't, but I never flaunted it. I drove a 5-year-old Honda, lived in a comfortable but modest home in Palo Alto, and invested everything I didn't need into building something bigger. That's where Emma came into the picture. Emma Rodriguez was everything I wasn't: polished, ambitious, and hungry for the spotlight. She worked as a marketing director at Phoenix Industries, one of those tech companies that looked impressive on paper but survived more on investor optimism than actual innovation. We met at a conference where she was presenting on digital transformation, and I was there as a consultant evaluating their technical infrastructure. Where she saw opportunity for growth and expansion, I saw systems held together with digital duct tape. But there was something about her drive, her absolute certainty that she could climb any mountain, that drew me in completely. Emma had the kind of beauty that turned heads in boardrooms, tall and elegant with the sharp intelligence that made men listen when she spoke. She came from a working-class family in San Diego, first-generation college graduate who clawed her way into Silicon Valley through pure determination. When we started dating, she told me she was tired of dating men who saw her ambition as threatening. I wasn't threatened. I was fascinated. Here was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to fight for it. I thought my steady success would complement her burning ambition perfectly. Our courtship felt like something from a business magazine success story. Weekend trips to Napa where she networked at wine tastings while I quietly enjoyed the scenery. Dinners at restaurants where she knew the sommelier by name, and I marveled at how effortlessly she commanded attention. She introduced me to her world of startup launches and industry galas, places where conversation moved at lightning speed between funding rounds and market valuations. I brought her into my world of quiet achievement, showing her the elegant code that powered the systems she marketed, teaching her to appreciate the beauty in well-built architecture. We married after 18 months, a ceremony at a vineyard in Sonoma that Emma planned with military precision. 200 guests, mostly her colleagues and contacts from the industry. My side was smaller, family from Sacramento, and a handful of close friends who understood that I preferred quality over quantity. Emma looked radiant in a dress that cost more than my car, and I felt proud to be the man she chose. During our vows, she promised to support each other's dreams, to build something greater together than either could alone. I believed every word. The first few years were exactly what I hoped marriage would be. Emma's career trajectory at Phoenix Industries was meteoric, rising from marketing director to senior director to vice president of strategic initiatives. She had found her calling in a company that valued her vision and rewarded her results. Phoenix was expanding aggressively, acquiring smaller companies and integrating their technologies. Emma's role was to identify acquisition targets and oversee the cultural integration, work that required her to travel frequently and attend industry events where deals were made over cocktails and handshakes. Meanwhile, my own consulting practice was thriving. Word had spread through Silicon Valley about the architect who could untangle the most complex systems and rebuild them stronger than before. I was working with 3 Fortune 500 companies simultaneously, each paying premium rates for my expertise. The irony wasn't lost on me. That while Emma's company was built on marketing promises and growth projections, my income came from fixing the technical disasters those promises often created. But I supported her completely, attending company events when she needed a +1, listening to her strategize about office politics, celebrating every promotion and achievement. Emma thrived in Phoenix's culture of aggressive ambition. The company had been founded by Marcus Coleman, a former tech executive who had built Phoenix from a small consulting firm into a billion-dollar acquisition machine. Coleman was the kind of CEO who made the cover of business magazines, silver hair and sharp-suited with the kind of confidence that convinced investors to write 8-figure checks. He demanded excellence from his team and rewarded it generously. Emma flourished under his leadership, and I watched her transform from ambitious to unstoppable. Phoenix Industries operated like a well-oiled machine designed to impress. Their downtown San Francisco headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower, all glass walls and open-concept spaces that screamed innovation and transparency. The company culture was built around Marcus Coleman's philosophy that success was a team sport, but only for players who could keep up with the pace. Monthly all-hands meetings felt like pep rallies, with Coleman delivering inspirational speeches about market domination and quarterly targets. Emma ate it up, and I could see why. Here was a place that didn't just tolerate ambition, it demanded it. Coleman himself was a master of corporate theater. He remembered everyone's name, asked about their families, and made each employee feel like they were part of something revolutionary. At company parties, he worked the room like a politician, making each conversation feel personal and important. Employees competed for his attention, and getting invited to his inner circle of trusted advisors was considered the ultimate career achievement. Emma had been working toward that recognition for 3 years, and I could see how badly she wanted it. The deeper Emma got into Phoenix's inner workings, the more I noticed subtle changes in her perspective. She started talking about people in terms of their value to the company, rather than their personal qualities. Conversations at home shifted from our shared dreams to her quarterly objectives and performance metrics. She began speaking in corporate buzzwords, talking about synergies and strategic initiatives, with the kind of enthusiasm she used to reserve for weekend getaways and quiet dinners together. I told myself it was natural career evolution, the price of success in a competitive industry. Emma's role required her to attend industry conferences and client entertainment events, opportunities to build relationships and identify potential acquisitions. She traveled to Austin, Seattle, and New York, returning with business cards and stories about deals that could transform Phoenix's market position. I supported her completely, managing our household during her trips and listening to her debrief about promising leads and competitive intelligence. She was building something important, and I wanted to be the stable foundation that made her success possible. The first crack in our foundation came during a conversation about a weekend retreat Emma's team was planning in Lake Tahoe. She mentioned that spouses weren't invited, that it was strictly a working session focused on strategic planning. I didn't think much of it until I saw photos on social media showing elaborate dinners and what looked more like a luxury vacation than a business meeting. When I asked about it, Emma became defensive, explaining that relationship building was a crucial part of business development. I let it go, but something felt different about the way she talked about her colleagues, particularly the men on Coleman's senior team. The distance between us grew gradually, so slowly that I almost didn't notice it happening. Emma stayed later at the office, explaining that Coleman expected his team to be available whenever inspiration struck. Weekend mornings that used to be hours became phone calls about urgent projects and market opportunities. Date nights were interrupted by messages from colleagues who needed immediate input on time-sensitive decisions. Emma apologized each time, but I could tell she was energized by being so essential, so central to Phoenix's success. I tried to bridge the gap by taking more interest in her work, asking questions about Phoenix's strategy and the challenges they were facing. Emma would light up talking about Coleman's vision for market expansion and her role in executing it. She spoke about him with an admiration that made me slightly uncomfortable, not because I was jealous, but because I recognized the way people talked about mentors who had become too important in their lives. Coleman wasn't just her boss, he was becoming the standard by which she measured success, ambition, and even personal worth. The annual Phoenix Industries Gala was Emma's chance to shine. She had been promoted to senior vice president just 2 months earlier, and this would be her first major company event in the new role. She spent weeks preparing, coordinating with event planners, and ensuring that every detail reflected Phoenix's commitment to excellence. The gala was held at the Fairmont San Francisco, one of those grand hotels that made every gathering feel historic and important. 200 of the company's top performers, biggest clients, and key investors would be there to celebrate another record-breaking year. Emma bought a new dress for the occasion, a stunning black evening gown that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She had her hair and makeup done professionally, and when she emerged from our bedroom that evening, she looked like she belonged on the cover of Fortune magazine. I wore my best suit, a charcoal gray that I'd had tailored specifically for occasions like this. As we drove to the city, Emma briefed me on who would be there and which conversations might be important for her career trajectory. I listened carefully, wanting to be the supportive husband who enhanced rather than hindered her professional relationships. The Fairmont's ballroom was transformed into something from a luxury magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables decorated with orchids and gold accents. A string quartet played near the entrance, while servers circulated with champagne and appetizers. Phoenix's logo was projected onto screens throughout the room, and every surface seemed to sparkle. Emma guided us through the crowd, introducing me to colleagues and clients with the practiced ease of someone who had mastered the art of corporate networking.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I shook hands, made polite conversation, and tried to contribute meaningfully to discussions about market trends and industry developments. Marcus Coleman held court near the center of the room, surrounded by a rotating group of employees and guests who competed for his attention. He was exactly as I'd imagined, tall and commanding with silver hair and a smile that suggested he'd never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. When he spotted Emma, his face lit up with genuine warmth. He excused himself from his current conversation and walked over to embrace her with the familiarity of someone who valued her contributions deeply. Coleman turned to me with that same warm smile and extended his hand. "You must be David," he said. "Emma talks about you all the time. The brilliant software architect who keeps the digital world running." His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct, and his voice carried the kind of authority that made people lean in when he spoke. I thanked him for the compliment and expressed my admiration for what he'd built at Phoenix. For a few minutes, we chatted about technology trends and the challenges of scaling systems for rapid growth. He seemed genuinely interested in my perspective, asking thoughtful questions about the technical infrastructure needed to support Phoenix's expansion plans. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing the dynamics around Coleman with growing fascination. Phoenix employees approached him like courtiers seeking an audience with royalty, each hoping to share an insight or accomplishment that would earn his approval. He managed these interactions masterfully, making each person feel heard while efficiently moving through the crowd. Emma was particularly animated in his presence, her laugh more frequent, her gestures more expansive. She was performing, I realized, showcasing the personality that had earned her rapid promotions and increasing responsibility. During dinner, I was seated at Emma's table along with several other Phoenix executives and their spouses. The conversation flowed between industry gossip, analysis of recent acquisitions, and speculation about future market opportunities. I contributed when I could, sharing technical perspectives on some of the challenges Phoenix might face as they scaled their operations. Several people seemed genuinely interested in my insights, asking follow-up questions about cybersecurity and system integration. For most of the evening, I felt welcomed and included in Phoenix's extended family. The trouble started during the cocktail hour after dinner. Emma had been pulled away for what she described as an important conversation with potential investors, leaving me to mingle on my own. I was comfortable enough at these events, capable of making small talk about technology trends and business developments. I found myself in a conversation with several Phoenix employees about the challenges of managing remote teams, a topic where my consulting experience provided valuable insights. The discussion was engaging and collegial, exactly the kind of professional networking Emma had encouraged me to pursue. That's when Marcus Coleman approached our group with a different energy than he'd displayed earlier. He'd been drinking throughout the evening, and while he wasn't obviously intoxicated, there was a looseness to his manner that suggested the alcohol had lowered some of his normal executive polish. He joined our conversation mid-discussion, making a joke about remote work that earned polite laughs from his employees. I continued sharing my perspective on maintaining team cohesion across distributed organizations, drawing from my experience working with companies across multiple time zones. Coleman listened for a few minutes before interrupting with a question that felt more like a challenge than genuine curiosity. "So David," he said, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before, "Emma tells me you work independently. Must be nice not having to worry about quarterly targets and investor expectations." The way he said independently made it sound like unemployment, and I felt the conversation's temperature drop a few degrees. I explained that I preferred the flexibility of consulting, the ability to choose projects that matched my expertise and interests. "Flexibility," Coleman repeated, swirling his whiskey. "That's code for not wanting the pressure of real responsibility." He looked around the group with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've always admired people who can afford to turn down challenges because they don't really need the money." The implication was clear. He was suggesting I was financially comfortable enough to avoid the kind of high-stakes work that defined success in his world. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level as I explained that my consulting work was actually quite demanding and required constant adaptation to new challenges. Coleman's smile widened, but it had taken on a predatory quality that made everyone in our small group shift uncomfortably. "Of course it is," he said. I'm sure debugging code and fixing other people's mistakes requires tremendous skill." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now. He was diminishing my work to the level of technical support, reducing 15 years of architectural expertise to basic troubleshooting. I felt anger rising in my chest, but I maintained my composure, recognizing that we were surrounded by his employees, who depended on his approval for their careers. The conversation had attracted attention from nearby tables, with people beginning to turn and listen as Coleman's voice grew louder and more animated. Emma appeared at the edge of the group, having finished her investor conversation, and I could see her confusion as she tried to read the tension that had settled over our discussion. Coleman noticed her arrival, and seemed to interpret it as an opportunity to escalate whatever point he was trying to make. "Emma," he called out, gesturing for her to join us. "I was just getting to know your husband better, learning about the consulting business." He put air quotes around consulting, and I felt my hands clench involuntarily. Emma moved to stand beside me, her smile uncertain as she tried to assess what she'd walked into. The group around us had grown larger, with other party guests drifting over to see what was drawing Coleman's attention. I realized we were becoming the evening's entertainment, though I didn't yet understand where this was heading. Coleman took a step closer, and I could smell the whiskey on his breath as he looked me up and down with obvious disdain. "You know what I appreciate about people like you, David," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet section of the ballroom. "You've figured out how to live comfortably, without actually creating anything of value. It's impressive, really. Finding wealthy women to marry so you can avoid the real work of building something meaningful." The words hit like a physical blow. Around us, conversations stopped entirely as people turned to witness what was clearly becoming a public confrontation. Emma's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to being called a gold digger by one of Silicon Valley's most prominent CEOs. The rational part of my mind knew I should de-escalate, make a polite excuse and walk away. But something deeper, something primal, wouldn't let me back down. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fury building inside me. "I've spent 15 years building critical systems for Fortune 500 companies. My work has saved corporations hundreds of millions in efficiency gains and prevented countless security breaches. I didn't marry Emma for her money. I married her because I love her." The words came out measured and professional, but I could feel my composure starting to crack under the pressure of public humiliation. Coleman laughed, a harsh sound that seemed designed to maximize my embarrassment. "Systems and efficiency gains," he repeated mockingly. "Listen to yourself. You're a technician, David. A very expensive technician perhaps, but still just someone who fixes things that actually successful people build." He gestured around the elegant ballroom, taking in the assembled crowd of Phoenix employees and clients. "Look around. These are people who create value, who take risks, who build companies that employ thousands and change industries. What do you create? What legacy are you leaving?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the crowd's anticipation growing. Emma stood frozen beside me, trapped between her loyalty to her husband and her dependence on the man who controlled her career. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, some sympathetic, others clearly enjoying the spectacle of watching someone get torn down in public. Coleman was performing now, using me as a prop in some demonstration of power that I didn't fully understand, but was beginning to recognize as calculated cruelty. "I create the foundation everything else stands on," I said, my voice carrying more edge than I intended. "Without architecture, without security, without the systems I build, your company would collapse in days. You market dreams and possibilities. I make them actually work." It was a good response, technically accurate and delivered with conviction, but I could see in Coleman's eyes that I'd just given him exactly the opening he wanted. Coleman's expression shifted from mockery to something approaching genuine anger. "Foundation work," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate level that somehow made his words more cutting. You know what we call that in the real business world, support staff. Essential, maybe, but ultimately replaceable. He paused, letting the insult sink in before delivering his final blow. The truth is, David, you're exactly what you look like. Poor trash who got lucky enough to marry up. The words exploded across the silent ballroom like a gunshot. Poor trash, said loud enough for everyone to hear, delivered with the kind of contempt usually reserved for actual enemies. I felt the blood drain from my face as the full weight of the insult hit me. Not just the words themselves, but the public nature of the humiliation, the fact that my wife's colleagues and clients were witnessing her husband being stripped of dignity in front of everyone who mattered in her professional world. Emma gasped beside me, her hand flying to cover her mouth in shock. Around us, the crowd stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't witnessed what just happened. Coleman stood there with satisfaction written across his face, clearly pleased with the impact of his attack. He'd wanted to hurt me, to demonstrate his power by destroying someone he saw as beneath him, and he'd succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. For a moment that felt like an eternity, I stood there absorbing the full impact of being publicly branded as poor trash by one of the most powerful men in Silicon Valley. Every eye in that ballroom was on me, waiting to see whether I would crumble under the assault or find some way to respond. Emma remained motionless beside me, her silence speaking louder than any words could have. This was her choice moment. Stand by her husband, or preserve her relationship with the man who controlled her career. The rage that had been building throughout the evening finally reached its breaking point. Not just at Coleman's words, but at the entire situation, at being treated like an accessory to my wife's success, at having my worth measured by someone else's standards of value and achievement. I looked around at the assembled crowd, at the faces full of pity and embarrassment and curiosity, and made a decision that would change everything. Poor trash, I repeated, my voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. Interesting perspective from someone whose company's entire technical infrastructure is held together with hopes and prayers. I pulled out my phone with deliberate slowness, opening an app I rarely used in public but always kept updated. Would you like to see what poor trash actually looks like, Marcus? The crowd pressed closer as I turned my phone screen toward Coleman and the people immediately around us. On the display was my primary investment account, the one I used for my most conservative holdings. The number at the top was stark and undeniable, $47 million. $47 million, accumulated over 15 years of solving problems that other people couldn't, invested carefully and growing steadily through bull and bear markets alike. Coleman's face went white as he processed what he was seeing. Around us, people craned their necks to get a glimpse of the screen, and I could hear whispers and gasps as the number spread through the crowd. Emma's eyes widened in shock, not at the amount itself, but at my willingness to display it so publicly. She knew I was successful, but I'd never flaunted wealth the way Phoenix's culture encouraged, never used money as a weapon or status symbol. That's just one account, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom. Would you like to see the others? The real estate holdings, the startup investments. I swiped to another screen showing my diversified portfolio, numbers that represented not just wealth but the compound result of 15 years of consistent success in a field Coleman clearly didn't understand or respect. The silence that followed was deafening. Coleman stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, anger and something approaching fear. He'd expected to humiliate a man he saw as beneath him, someone who would absorb the insult and slink away in shame. Instead, he was facing the uncomfortable reality that the poor trash he'd just publicly attacked was worth more than most of the people in that room combined. I closed the phone and slipped it back into my pocket, then looked directly at Coleman with the kind of calm confidence that comes from holding all the cards. The difference between us, Marcus, is that I built this wealth by creating real value, not by convincing investors to fund dreams that may never materialize. I don't need to tear other people down to feel successful, and I don't need to perform my worth at charity galas. The crowd around us had grown to include nearly half the party guests, all drawn by the spectacle of watching their CEO get systematically destroyed by the man he'd just tried to humiliate. Coleman's employees looked mortified, caught between their dependence on his approval and their shock at witnessing him get so thoroughly outmaneuvered. Emma stood beside me looking pale and shaken, as if she was seeing both her husband and her boss clearly for the first time. Coleman's recovery was swift but incomplete. He forced a laugh that sounded hollow in the elegant ballroom, looking around at his employees and guests as if searching for support that wasn't coming. "Well," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence, "I suppose we all learned something tonight about assumptions." It was a pathetic attempt to save face, but the damage was irreversible. Everyone in that room had watched him attack someone based on his own prejudices and get completely destroyed in response. I could have left it there, could have accepted his weak attempt at gracious defeat and allowed the evening to end with my dignity intact. But something in Emma's continued silence, in the way she stood there looking more concerned about Coleman's embarrassment than her husband's humiliation, pushed me over the edge. The rage I'd been controlling all evening finally found its voice, and I decided to finish what he had started. "Actually, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through his attempts to change the subject, "since we're being honest about assumptions, let me share one of mine. I assume that a man who builds a billion-dollar company on acquisition debt and investor optimism while attacking people for their wealth might be compensating for something. Care to show us your bank account?" The question landed like a bomb in the middle of the ballroom. Coleman's face flushed red, then went pale, as if I'd just exposed something he'd spent years trying to hide. Around us, people shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this had moved beyond a simple confrontation into something much more dangerous. I'd just challenged the financial foundation of Phoenix Industries in front of 200 of its most important stakeholders. Emma grabbed my arm, her grip tight and desperate. "David, please," she whispered, but I was beyond listening to her concerns about corporate politics and career consequences. Coleman had made this personal when he called me poor trash in front of everyone who mattered in her professional world. Now he was going to face the consequences of attacking someone who understood exactly how fragile his empire really was. Coleman tried to regain control of the situation with corporate bluster. "I think we've all had enough entertainment for one evening," he said, attempting to project the kind of authority that usually ended uncomfortable conversations. But his voice lacked conviction, and everyone in that room could sense his desperation. He'd opened a door he couldn't close, started a fight he was losing badly, and now he was trapped in front of his own people with nowhere to retreat. I smiled at him, the kind of expression that suggested I was just getting started. "Oh, I'm just getting warmed up," I said. "Since you're so interested in who creates real value, let's talk about Phoenix Industries' actual financial position. Shall we discuss your debt-to-equity ratio, your dependence on acquisition financing, the fact that your company's valuation is built on growth projections that require perfect execution in an increasingly competitive market?" The words hit Coleman like physical blows. Around us, investors and board members who'd been enjoying the social atmosphere suddenly looked concerned, recognizing that their entertainment had become a serious discussion about Phoenix's business fundamentals. Coleman's employees shifted nervously, unused to seeing their seemingly invincible CEO look so vulnerable and exposed. Emma stood frozen beside me, watching her professional world crumble in real time. "You want to know the difference between real wealth and corporate theater?" I continued, pulling out my phone again. "Real wealth doesn't require investor presentations and quarterly guidance to maintain its value. It doesn't depend on market sentiment, or growth projections, or the next acquisition to justify its existence." I opened another app, this one showing real-time market data for Phoenix's publicly traded stock. Speaking of which, how has Phoenix's share price performed over the past 6 months? Down 18%, while the broader market gained 12%. Coleman's face was now completely drained of color. He'd started the evening as the master of ceremonies, the confident CEO celebrating another successful year with his team and investors. Now he stood exposed and defensive in front of everyone who mattered to his company's future. The crowd around us had grown silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, the complete destruction of a powerful man's reputation in real time. I could have stopped there. I'd made my point, defended my honor, and demonstrated that Coleman's assumptions about my worth were spectacularly wrong. But something about Emma's continued silence, about the way she seemed more concerned with managing the fallout than supporting her husband, pushed me to deliver one final blow that would ensure Coleman never forgot the cost of underestimating people he didn't understand. "Here's the thing about calling someone poor trash, Marcus," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "It reveals more about your character than theirs. A truly successful person doesn't need to tear others down to feel powerful. They don't need to perform their worth at charity galas or attack people based on assumptions about their background." I paused, letting the words sink in. "The fact that you felt the need to humiliate me publicly suggests you saw something in me that threatened you. And now everyone here knows you were right to be afraid." The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Coleman stood there looking smaller than his expensive suit, his silver hair and practiced smile unable to mask the fact that he'd been systematically destroyed by the man he'd tried to humiliate. Around us, 200 of the most important people in Phoenix's universe had watched their leader reveal himself to be petty, cruel, and ultimately powerless when faced with someone who understood the difference between real success and corporate performance. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the ballroom's exit. Behind me, I could hear Emma calling my name, her voice desperate and panicked. The crowd parted as I moved through them, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration to fear at what they'd witnessed. Some nodded respectfully, others looked away, but everyone understood that they'd just seen something extraordinary, the complete reversal of power in real time. As I reached the ballroom doors, I turned back one final time. Emma was still standing next to Coleman, her hand on his arm in what looked like comfort or support. The image burned itself into my memory, my wife consoling the man who had just publicly humiliated me rather than following her husband out of the room. In that moment, I understood that everything I'd thought I knew about our marriage, about her loyalty, about our shared values, had been an illusion I'd been too blind to see. I walked out of the Fairmont San Francisco and into the cool night air, leaving behind not just a party but an entire chapter of my life. The fog was rolling in from the bay, wrapping the city in a blanket of mist that seemed appropriate for the transformation I'd just experienced. I'd entered that ballroom as Emma's supportive husband, the quiet architect who stayed in the background while she built her career. I was leaving as something entirely different, a man who'd been tested in fire and emerged stronger than anyone, including myself, had expected. The drive home from San Francisco to Palo Alto had never felt longer. I sat in traffic on 101, surrounded by the tail lights of other late-night travelers, replaying every moment of what had just happened. The adrenaline from confronting Coleman was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold clarity that made me question everything I thought I understood about my marriage. Emma had stayed. After watching her husband get publicly attacked, after witnessing him defend himself and emerge victorious, she had chosen to remain at that party rather than leave with me. My phone buzzed continuously with calls from Emma, but I let them go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear her explanations, her attempts to justify staying behind to manage the fallout with her colleagues. The silence in my car felt profound after the chaos of the ballroom, and I used it to think clearly for the first time in months. Coleman's attack hadn't come from nowhere. Men like him didn't randomly humiliate people at company events unless they had a reason, unless they saw some threat that needed to be eliminated. When I finally reached our house in Palo Alto, the familiar sight of our craftsman-style home felt foreign somehow, as if I was seeing it through different eyes. Emma's Tesla wasn't in the driveway, confirming that she had indeed stayed at the party rather than following her husband home. I sat in my car for several minutes, looking at the house we'd bought together 3 years ago, remembering how excited we'd been to create a home that reflected both our tastes and aspirations. Now it felt like a museum of a marriage that might already be over. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The photos on our mantelpiece told the story of 5 years together, from our early dating days through our wedding and various vacations and celebrations. In every picture, Emma looked radiant and confident, while I stood beside her with the steady presence of someone who believed he was building something permanent. Looking at those images now, I wondered how much of our relationship had been real and how much had been performance, the successful woman and her supportive husband playing roles we thought we were supposed to fill. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into my home office, the space where I did most of my consulting work. The room was lined with technical manuals and industry certifications, physical representations of the expertise I'd spent 15 years developing. My multiple monitors displayed the sophisticated trading platforms and portfolio management tools I used to track my investments, systems that had helped me accumulate wealth that Coleman never could have imagined. But sitting there, surrounded by the tools of my success, I felt more alone than I had since before I met Emma. The house felt different without Emma's energy filling it, without her phone calls echoing from the kitchen or the sound of her heels clicking across the hardwood floors as she prepared for another important meeting. I'd grown accustomed to being the steady presence in our dynamic partnership, the man who handled the details of our personal life while she conquered the corporate world. But now, in the silence of our empty home, I began to question whether that partnership had been as balanced as I'd believed. Emma didn't come home that night. At 2 in the morning, she sent a single text message explaining that she was staying at her colleague Sarah's apartment downtown, that she needed time to process what had happened and figure out how to handle the professional implications. The message was polite but distant, lacking any acknowledgement of what I had endured or any concern for how I was processing the evening's events. It read like a business communication rather than something from a wife to her husband after a traumatic experience. I spent the night lying awake, analyzing every aspect of the evening, with the same systematic approach I used to debug complex software systems. Coleman's behavior had been calculated, designed to humiliate me in front of the exact audience that mattered most to Emma's career. His attacks had focused on my worth as a partner, questioning whether I was an asset or liability to someone as successful as Emma. The implications were clear. He saw me as competition for Emma's attention and loyalty, and he wanted to demonstrate his power by destroying me publicly. But there was something else, something that bothered me more than Coleman's cruelty or even Emma's abandonment. Throughout the evening, I'd noticed subtle dynamics that I'd previously dismissed as normal corporate culture, the way Phoenix employees spoke about Coleman with an intensity that went beyond professional respect, the manner in which Emma's voice changed when she talked about him, becoming more animated and engaged, the frequency of their late-night calls and weekend meetings that she explained as business necessity. Morning brought no relief from the questions that had kept me awake all night. I made coffee and checked my phone, finding 17 missed calls from Emma and a handful of voicemails I wasn't ready to hear. Instead, I opened my laptop and began doing what I did best: research. If Coleman had targeted me so specifically, if he'd felt threatened enough to risk his reputation by attacking me publicly, then there had to be reasons beyond simple dislike of successful spouses. I started with Phoenix Industries itself, diving deep into their financial filings and corporate structure with the thoroughness of someone conducting due diligence for a major acquisition. What I found was troubling but not surprising. Phoenix's aggressive growth strategy was built on a foundation of debt and optimistic projections that required perfect execution to remain viable. Their recent acquisitions had been financed through increasingly complex instruments that would become problematic if their growth targets weren't met consistently. The deeper I dug into Phoenix's operations, the clearer it became that Coleman was under tremendous pressure from investors and board members to deliver results that justified the company's inflated valuation. Several of their recent acquisitions had failed to integrate successfully, creating write-downs that were carefully buried in quarterly reports but visible to anyone who knew where to look. Phoenix wasn't the unstoppable growth machine it appeared to be in press releases and investor presentations. It was a company walking a tightrope, dependent on maintaining confidence to avoid a precipitous fall, but the financial stress wasn't what captured my attention most. As I traced through Phoenix's organizational charts and executive communications, I began to notice patterns in how Coleman managed his senior team. He cultivated intense personal loyalty through a combination of generous compensation, exclusive access, and the kind of attention that made people feel chosen and special. His inner circle worked extraordinary hours and traveled extensively together, creating bonds that went beyond normal professional relationships. Emma's travel schedule over the past year suddenly took on new significance as I reviewed the calendar invitations and expense reports I'd helped her organize. She'd attended conferences in Miami, Austin, Chicago, and Denver, always as part of Coleman's strategic planning team. The hotels were always luxury properties, the dinners were at exclusive restaurants, and the schedules included significant blocks of time marked simply as team building or strategic discussions. I'd supported these trips enthusiastically, proud that Emma was valued enough to be included in Phoenix's highest-level planning sessions. Now looking at the patterns with fresh eyes, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Emma's trips corresponded exactly with periods when she'd seemed most distant at home, most energized by her work, most critical of the quiet life we'd built together. She'd return from these excursions talking about Coleman's vision with the kind of enthusiasm she'd once reserved for our own shared dreams. I'd attributed her excitement to career growth and professional fulfillment, but the correlation was too precise to be coincidental. I spent the morning cross-referencing Emma's travel with social media posts from her colleagues, building a timeline of Phoenix's executive team activities over the past 18 months. What emerged was a picture of a group that functioned more like a family than a corporate team, with Coleman as the charismatic patriarch who commanded absolute devotion. They celebrated birthdays together, attended each other's personal events, and shared inside jokes that excluded anyone not part of their inner circle. Emma hadn't just found a mentor in Coleman, she'd found a community that made our marriage feel mundane by comparison. The breakthrough came when I accessed Emma's shared calendar to check a dinner reservation I needed to cancel. Buried among her normal business appointments was a recurring monthly entry labeled simply as MC Strategy Session that ran from Friday evening through Sunday afternoon. The locations rotated between luxury resorts in California, Nevada, and Arizona, places that seemed more appropriate for romantic getaways than business meetings. The attendee list was always the same: Coleman and 3 or 4 of his senior executives, including Emma. My hands were trembling as I opened Emma's credit card statements, documents I had access to as her husband for household budget planning. The charges from these weekend retreats painted a picture that destroyed any remaining illusions I had about their purpose. Spa treatments, couples massages, intimate dinners at restaurants that specialized in romantic atmospheres. Wine tastings and sunset cruises that were charged to Phoenix's corporate account, but clearly designed for pleasure rather than business. Room service charges that arrived at times suggesting leisurely mornings rather than early business meetings. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to be absolutely certain before confronting Emma with accusations that would end our marriage permanently. I used my technical skills to access the cloud storage accounts where Emma backed up her phone photos, something she'd given me permission to do years ago when we were consolidating our digital lives. What I found there removed any remaining doubt about the nature of her relationship with Coleman and several other Phoenix executives. The photos told a story that Emma's explanations had carefully omitted. Images from the luxury retreats showed her in intimate settings with Coleman and other team members, laughing over wine glasses in private dining rooms, embracing on sunset balconies, sharing hot tubs under desert stars. The body language in these photos was unmistakable, showing relationships that had moved far beyond professional collaboration into something much more personal and complex. But it was the metadata that provided the most damaging evidence. Photos taken at 2 and 3 in the morning in hotel rooms, images of Emma in designer lingerie that I'd never seen her wear at home, pictures of her sharing beds with people whose presence could only be explained by relationships that violated every promise we'd made to each other. The timestamps and location data created an irrefutable timeline of betrayal that stretched back almost 2 years, coinciding exactly with Emma's promotion into Coleman's inner circle. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Emma hadn't just been having an affair, she'd been living an entirely separate life with Phoenix's executive team, participating in relationships and activities that made our marriage feel like a part-time commitment. The weekend retreats, the late-night calls, the business trips that kept her away from home increasingly frequently, all of it was part of a sophisticated arrangement that let her enjoy the stability of marriage while pursuing whatever pleasures Coleman's inner circle provided. I printed out the most damaging photos and documents, creating a file that documented the extent of Emma's betrayal with clinical precision. Each image was time-stamped and cross-referenced with her explanations to me about work travel and business necessities. The contradictions were stark and undeniable, showing a pattern of lies that had allowed her to maintain her double life without suspicion for nearly 2 years. I'd been the faithful husband managing our household while she explored relationships that made our marriage irrelevant. As I compiled the evidence, I began to understand Coleman's motivation for attacking me so viciously at the party. He hadn't just disliked me personally, he'd seen me as an obstacle to his complete control over Emma's loyalty and attention. By humiliating me publicly, he'd hoped to drive a wedge between us that would push Emma fully into his sphere of influence. His mistake had been underestimating my ability to fight back and overestimating Emma's commitment to defending her husband when her career interests were threatened. The irony wasn't lost on me that Coleman's attack had actually done me a favor by forcing me to examine our marriage with the same analytical rigor I applied to complex technical problems. Without his provocation, I might have continued accepting Emma's explanations for her distance and distraction, remaining blind to the systematic betrayal that had been happening under my nose for nearly 2 years. His cruelty had inadvertently given me the clarity I needed to see the truth about the woman I'd married. By noon, I had assembled a comprehensive dossier documenting Emma's infidelity and the corrupt culture at Phoenix Industries that had enabled it. The evidence was overwhelming and legally actionable, providing grounds for divorce that would protect my assets and reputation regardless of how Emma chose to respond. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet. First, I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with, to ensure that I had every advantage when the inevitable confrontation occurred. I spent the afternoon researching divorce law in California, focusing on cases involving adultery and financial misconduct. What I learned was encouraging from a legal standpoint but devastating from a personal one. California's no-fault divorce laws meant that Emma's infidelity wouldn't necessarily impact the division of assets, but the evidence I'd gathered would be crucial in protecting my separate property and ensuring that she couldn't claim entitlement to wealth I'd accumulated independently. More importantly, the documentation would prevent her from painting me as the villain in our marriage's dissolution. Emma finally came home that evening, arriving after dark with the exhausted expression of someone who had spent the day managing a crisis. She found me in my office, surrounded by printouts and legal documents that I made no effort to hide from her view. Her face went pale as she recognized some of the images and bank statements spread across my desk, understanding immediately that her carefully maintained deception had been completely exposed. For several minutes we stood there in silence, the weight of 2 years of lies hanging between us like a physical presence. Emma's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she tried to find words that could possibly explain or justify what I'd discovered. Finally she sank into the chair across from my desk and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with what might have been tears or simply the shock of being caught so completely off guard. "How long have you known?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible. It wasn't an admission of guilt exactly, but it was close enough to confirm that everything I'd discovered was accurate. She wasn't going to insult my intelligence by denying the evidence or claiming that the photos and documents had been doctored or misinterpreted. We were past the point where lies could serve any purpose. "I figured it out today," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger and hurt churning inside me. "After you chose to stay at that party instead of coming home with your husband. After you spent the night consoling Coleman instead of making sure I was all right. That's when I started asking the right questions and looking in the right places." I gestured at the evidence spread across my desk. "And here we are." Emma raised her head to look at me, her makeup smeared and her perfect professional facade finally cracked beyond repair. "David, please let me explain," she began, but I cut her off with a raised hand. I'd heard enough explanations from her over the past 2 years. Enough justifications for late nights and weekend trips and intimate conversations with colleagues. The time for explanations had passed the moment she'd chosen Coleman over me at that party. "There's nothing to explain," I said quietly. "The evidence speaks for itself. You've been living a double life for almost 2 years, participating in relationships that violate every promise you made to me. You've been lying to my face while I supported your career and managed our household and believed that we were building something together." My voice remained steady, but I could feel the pain underneath the words, the grief of losing someone I'd loved more than my own life. Emma started to speak again, but I continued before she could interrupt. "What I want to know is why you married me in the first place. Was it ever real, or was I just a convenient placeholder until something better came along? Because looking at these photos, reading these messages, it's clear that our marriage has been meaningless to you for a very long time. I just want to understand when it stopped mattering." The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Emma struggling to find an answer that wouldn't inflict more damage than had already been done. Finally she looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said, "It was real. In the beginning, it was completely real. You were everything I thought I wanted, everything I believed would make me happy. But then Phoenix happened, and Coleman happened, and I discovered parts of myself I didn't know existed." Her honesty was brutal, but somehow appreciated. At least she wasn't insulting my intelligence with claims that the affair meant nothing or that she'd been planning to end it. She was acknowledging that she'd chosen a different life, one that didn't include the man she'd promised to love and honor. It didn't make the betrayal hurt less, but it made her seem human again, rather than a stranger wearing my wife's face. "So what happens now?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer, we both did. There was no coming back from this level of deception, no way to rebuild trust that had been so systematically destroyed. The marriage was over, we were just negotiating the terms of its dissolution. The only question was whether we could end it with some dignity intact, or whether it would degenerate into the kind of bitter legal battle that would hurt us both. Emma wiped her eyes and looked at me with something approaching her old directness. "I suppose you want a divorce," she said, and I could hear the resignation in her voice. She wasn't going to fight for our marriage because she didn't want it anymore. Phoenix had given her something that our relationship couldn't match, some combination of excitement and validation and community that made our quiet life together seem insufficient by comparison. "I think that's inevitable," I replied. "The question is whether we can handle this like adults or whether it needs to become ugly. I have no interest in destroying you publicly, but I also won't let you paint me as the villain in this story. You made your choices, and now we both have to live with the consequences." I gestured at the evidence on my desk. "This documentation ensures that I can protect myself legally, but I'd prefer to keep it private if possible." Emma nodded, understanding that I held all the cards in any divorce proceedings. The evidence of her infidelity was overwhelming and legally actionable, giving me significant advantages in asset division and public relations. She couldn't claim that I'd been an unsupportive husband or that our marriage had failed due to my inadequacies. The facts showed that she'd systematically betrayed our relationship while I'd remained faithful and supportive throughout. "I'll move out tonight," she said quietly. "I can stay with Sarah until I find my own place. I know this is my fault, David. I know I've destroyed something good because I was selfish and weak. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I never intended for it to go this far." She stood up slowly, looking around the office where we'd spent so many evenings together, her working on presentations while I managed our finances and investments. As she reached the door, Emma turned back one final time. "For what it's worth, Coleman's attack on you tonight was completely out of line. You handled it better than anyone could have expected, and you proved that you're a better man than he'll ever be. I'm sorry I wasn't there to support you. I'm sorry I've been such a coward." With that, she left the room, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs as she went to pack her belongings. I sat alone in my office, surrounded by the wreckage of my marriage, feeling oddly calm despite everything that had happened. The confrontation with Emma had been painful but necessary, and her honesty had provided closure that would have been impossible if she'd continued lying or making excuses. We were done, but we were ending it with some measure of mutual respect intact, which was more than many couples achieved under similar circumstances. Over the next several hours, I listened to Emma moving through our house, packing clothes and personal items into suitcases. She was quiet and efficient, taking only what belonged clearly to her and leaving behind the shared possessions that represented our life together. When she was finished, she appeared in my office doorway one final time to leave her wedding ring on my desk, a gesture that felt both symbolic and practical. "I'll have my attorney contact yours about the divorce proceedings," she said. "I won't contest anything or make this difficult. It's the least I can do after everything I've put you through." She paused, seeming to search for words that could somehow minimize the damage she'd done. Finally, she simply said, "Goodbye, David. I hope you find someone who deserves you." After Emma left, the house felt simultaneously empty and peaceful. The constant undercurrent of tension that had characterized our relationship over the past year was gone, replaced by the silence of truth finally acknowledged. I poured myself another glass of wine and sat in our living room, looking at the photos and mementos that told the story of our relationship from beginning to end. Tomorrow I would start the process of rebuilding my life as a single man, but tonight, I allowed myself to mourn the marriage that had ended, and the future we would never share. The divorce proceedings moved forward with surprising smoothness over the following weeks. Emma kept her word about not contesting anything, and her attorney seemed eager to settle quickly, rather than risk having the evidence of her infidelity become part of the public record. We divided our assets fairly, with each of us keeping what we'd brought to the marriage plus half of what we'd accumulated together. The house would be sold, with proceeds split equally, allowing both of us to start fresh in new environments. What surprised me was how quickly Emma seemed to adapt to her new life. Within a month of our separation, she'd moved into a luxury apartment in San Francisco's Soma district, closer to Phoenix's headquarters and the social scene that had captured her attention. Social media showed her attending the same industry events and charity galas we'd once attended together, but now she was there as Coleman's recognized partner, rather than a married woman accompanying her husband. The transition appeared seamless, as if our 5-year marriage had been nothing more than an interlude in her real life. Meanwhile, I found myself reevaluating everything about the life I'd built in Silicon Valley. The revelation of Emma's betrayal had forced me to confront how much of my identity had been tied to being her husband, how much of my social life had depended on her connections and introductions. Without her, I was free to choose relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than professional networking, to pursue interests that had nothing to do with corporate advancement or industry positioning. The process of selling our Palo Alto house was both practically necessary and emotionally liberating. Each room held memories of our life together, but they were now tainted by the knowledge of Emma's deception during the final 2 years. I found myself looking forward to leaving behind the physical reminders of a relationship that had been built on incomplete honesty. The sale proceeds, combined with my existing investments, gave me the financial freedom to choose my next chapter based on personal fulfillment rather than economic necessity. As I prepared to close that chapter of my life, I couldn't help but reflect on the events that had set everything in motion. Coleman's attack at the Phoenix Gala had been intended to humiliate me and drive a wedge between Emma and me that would secure her complete loyalty to his organization. Instead, his cruelty had forced me to examine my marriage with clear eyes and discover truths that might have remained hidden for years longer. In trying to destroy me, he had inadvertently given me the information I needed to reclaim my freedom and dignity. The irony was that Coleman had been right about one thing: Emma and I weren't well matched, but his analysis had been completely backward. She wasn't too good for me, rather we had fundamentally different values about loyalty, honesty and commitment that made us incompatible in the long term. His affair with her hadn't elevated her beyond my reach, it had revealed that she'd never been the woman I thought I'd married. The truth was painful, but ultimately liberating, freeing me to find someone whose character actually matched my own. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the lobby of my new headquarters in Austin, Texas, watching my team celebrate the completion of our biggest project yet. The irony wasn't lost on me that Phoenix Industries had been our client, desperate enough to hire the man their former CEO had publicly humiliated, when their entire technical infrastructure collapsed spectacularly. Emma had tried calling me when she heard about the contract, but I'd let it go to voicemail like all her other attempts at reconciliation over the past year. The move to Austin had been liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Silicon Valley's obsession with status and appearances felt suffocating after everything I'd experienced with Emma and Phoenix. Texas offered something simpler, a place where results mattered more than networking, and where building something substantial was valued over talking about disruption and innovation. I'd bought a ranch-style house with actual land around it, space to breathe and think without feeling like I was performing for neighbors who measured worth by car brands and zip codes. Chen Solutions had grown from a one-man consulting practice to a team of 12 brilliant engineers who shared my philosophy about building systems that actually worked. We focused on clients who needed real solutions rather than impressive presentations, companies that valued reliability over flash. The contrast with my previous life was stark and entirely intentional. Instead of attending industry galas and charity events, I spent evenings riding horses on my property or having barbecues with colleagues who had become genuine friends. The Phoenix contract had arrived through intermediaries, board members who'd witnessed Coleman's public meltdown at the gala and remembered how I'd handled the situation. After Emma's departure, the company's executive team had dissolved into infighting and paranoia. Coleman's leadership style, which had seemed so charismatic when everyone was unified around shared success, proved toxic when trust began breaking down. Key employees departed, taking critical knowledge with them. Investors pulled funding. Stock prices plummeted as quarterly earnings consistently missed projections. The technical infrastructure I'd warned them about during dinner conversations had finally collapsed under the weight of rapid growth and inadequate planning. Their acquisition spree had created a patchwork of incompatible systems that couldn't communicate effectively. Customer data was corrupted, financial reporting was unreliable, and security breaches were becoming routine embarrassments. The company that had once seemed unstoppable was hemorrhaging money and reputation at an alarming rate. When Phoenix's board reached out through intermediaries, they were desperate enough to pay premium rates for immediate intervention. The contract terms were extraordinary, not just financially but in terms of control and autonomy. I would have complete authority over technical decisions, direct access to the board, and the right to terminate the engagement if anyone interfered with my team's work. It was the kind of deal I never would have negotiated in my previous life, but divorce and public humiliation had taught me the value of protecting myself from other people's chaos. Coleman was conspicuously absent from all negotiations and planning sessions. Board members mentioned vaguely that he was taking a sabbatical to focus on strategic planning, but industry gossip suggested he'd been pushed into a purely ceremonial role while real leadership shifted to the CFO and COO. The man who had once commanded absolute loyalty from his team was now reportedly isolated and defensive, blaming external factors for Phoenix's decline, rather than acknowledging his role in creating the toxic culture that had driven away top talent. Flying into San Francisco for the project kickoff felt surreal after everything that had happened. The city looked the same, but I experienced it differently now, with the confidence of someone who had survived public humiliation and personal betrayal to build something better. My team was staying at a downtown hotel near Phoenix's headquarters, and I'd arranged for us to work on-site to better understand the scope of the technical problems we were facing. The Phoenix offices felt like a mausoleum compared to my memories from Emma's tenure there. The open-concept workspace that had once buzzed with ambitious energy was now half-empty, with remaining employees looking stressed and demoralized. The glass-walled conference rooms where deals had once been celebrated now hosted tense meetings about damage control and cost reduction. It was a vivid illustration of how quickly corporate culture could collapse when leadership failed and trust evaporated. Emma appeared in the lobby on our second day, looking polished but somehow diminished compared to my memories. She'd been promoted to Chief Marketing Officer in the wake of the executive departures, a title that sounded impressive but carried responsibility for managing a company's reputation during its worst crisis. Her smile was tentative as she approached, clearly uncertain how I would react to seeing her in person for the first time since our divorce. "Hello, David," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I wanted to welcome you and thank you for taking on this project. I know the board is grateful for your expertise." The formality was jarring after 5 years of marriage, but probably necessary given our history and the professional context. She looked tired in a way that expensive makeup couldn't entirely conceal, carrying the stress of trying to salvage a company that seemed determined to destroy itself. "Emma," I replied with equal formality, "I'm here to do a job. The personal history doesn't factor into my professional obligations." It wasn't meant to be cruel, just clear about boundaries. We were no longer married couple working through relationship issues. We were business professionals with a shared interest in Phoenix's technical recovery. The distinction was important for both of us to maintain. She nodded, accepting the boundary I'd established. "If you need anything during your time here, please let me know. I want this project to succeed." There was something in her tone that suggested she understood more than she was saying, that Phoenix's survival might depend on my team's ability to repair the damage that months of mismanagement had created. It was a level of vulnerability I'd never seen from her during our marriage. Over the following weeks, my team worked methodically through Phoenix's technical disasters, documenting failures and designing replacement systems with the precision of forensic investigators. The scope of the problems was staggering: years of shortcuts and patch fixes that had created a digital house of cards waiting to collapse. Every system we examined revealed new layers of incompetence and neglect that explained why the company had been hemorrhaging money and credibility. The work was satisfying in a way that went beyond professional accomplishment. Each problem we solved felt like justice for the man who had been publicly humiliated for supposedly being worthless to successful people. Coleman had built his reputation by claiming credit for other people's work while attacking anyone he perceived as competition. Now his empire was being saved by the technical expertise he'd dismissed as support staff. A irony so perfect it felt like cosmic balance being restored. 3 weeks into the project, Coleman finally appeared at the office for what was described as a routine check-in with the board. He looked older than I remembered, his silver hair showing gray roots and his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that suggested significant weight loss. The confident swagger that had once dominated every room was replaced by the careful movements of someone who knew he was walking on thin ice professionally. Our encounter was brief but illuminating. He nodded politely when we passed in the hallway, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes showing recognition of the role reversal that had occurred. The man who had once called me poor trash now depended on my expertise to save his company from bankruptcy. He didn't attempt conversation or acknowledgement of our history, probably recognizing that any discussion would only highlight how completely circumstances had changed. The final phase of our work involved presenting the new technical architecture to Phoenix's board and senior staff. I stood in the same conference room where Coleman had once held court, explaining how my team had rebuilt their systems to be more secure, efficient, and scalable than anything they'd previously possessed. The board members listened intently, asking detailed questions that demonstrated their understanding of how critical this infrastructure was to the company's survival. Emma attended the presentation in her role as CMO, taking notes on how the technical improvements could be communicated to investors and customers who had lost confidence in Phoenix's reliability. She seemed genuinely impressed by what my team had accomplished, nodding approvingly as I explained features that would prevent the kinds of failures that had damaged the company's reputation. There was professional respect in her attention that had been missing from our marriage. After the presentation, several board members approached me privately to discuss the possibility of a permanent consulting arrangement. Phoenix's recovery would require ongoing technical leadership, and they'd been impressed not just by my team's competence but by our ability to deliver results without the drama that had characterized previous executive relationships. The offer was generous and would have provided significant ongoing revenue, but I declined after careful consideration. The reason for my refusal was simple: I'd already gotten what I came for. The project had been about more than money or professional accomplishment. It had been about proving that the man Coleman dismissed as poor trash possessed skills valuable enough to save the empire he'd spent years building. The board's confidence in my abilities, the successful completion of an impossible technical rescue, and the knowledge that Phoenix's future depended on systems I'd designed provided all the vindication I needed. On our final day at Phoenix, Emma approached me in the parking garage as my team loaded equipment into our rental van. The setting was private enough for honest conversation, away from corporate posturing and professional obligations. She looked relieved that the project was ending successfully, knowing that my team's work had bought Phoenix time to address its deeper cultural and leadership problems. "Thank you," she said simply. "I know you didn't have to take this contract, especially given our history. You could have let the company fail and felt justified doing it." Her acknowledgement was important to me, recognition that I'd chosen professional integrity over personal revenge, despite having every reason to enjoy Phoenix's struggles. It suggested that she understood something about character that she'd missed during our marriage. "I don't take satisfaction in other people's failures," I replied. "The company employs a lot of good people who don't deserve to lose their jobs because of leadership mistakes." And professionally, this was an interesting challenge that showcased my team's capabilities. It was true, though incomplete. The project had also been about proving that Coleman's assessment of my worth had been spectacularly wrong, a point I didn't need to make explicitly. Emma nodded, seeming to understand the unspoken elements of my motivation. "I've learned a lot about leadership and loyalty over the past year," she said. "About the difference between being valued for what you can contribute and being manipulated for someone else's benefit. I should have seen those distinctions earlier, should have appreciated what we had instead of chasing something that was ultimately hollow." Her insight was accurate but came too late to matter for our relationship. The betrayal and deception had created damage that couldn't be repaired by understanding or regret. We were different people now, shaped by experiences that had revealed fundamental incompatibilities in our values and priorities. The marriage that had once seemed permanent was now just history that had taught us both important lessons about ourselves and each other. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said. And meant it. Emma deserved happiness, even if our paths to finding it had diverged permanently. She'd made mistakes that had cost our marriage, but she was learning from them in ways that suggested future relationships might benefit from her painful education about loyalty and trust. The drive back to Austin felt like closing a chapter that had defined too much of my adult life. Silicon Valley's ambitions and complications were behind me now, replaced by the simpler clarity of building something valuable with people I respected. The Phoenix Project had provided closure on the humiliation I'd suffered at Coleman's hands while proving that success could be measured by contribution rather than status. My phone buzzed with a text message as we crossed into Nevada, a note from one of Phoenix's board members expressing gratitude for our work and mentioning that Coleman had announced his resignation that morning. The news felt anticlimactic rather than triumphant, like learning that a problem had solved itself rather than achieving a victory over an opponent. Coleman's fall had been inevitable once his leadership failures became impossible to ignore. My role had simply been to prevent his mistakes from destroying an entire company. Back in Austin, life returned to its comfortable rhythm of meaningful work and genuine relationships. Chen Solutions continued growing as word spread about our Phoenix success, attracting clients who valued competence over personality and substance over style. The ranch house felt more like home each day, a place where worth was measured by character and contribution rather than net worth and social connections. Sometimes, late in the evening while riding across my property, I reflected on the trajectory that had brought me from public humiliation to professional triumph. Coleman's attack had been intended to diminish me, but had instead forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed. Emma's betrayal had been devastating, but had ultimately freed me to find relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenient compatibility. The story had an ending that felt like justice without requiring revenge, success without needing to destroy others, and closure without demanding apologies that couldn't undo past damage. I'd learned that real strength came from building something valuable rather than tearing down opponents, that true success was measured by personal fulfillment rather than external validation, and that the best response to cruelty was excellence that spoke for itself. The man who had once felt like an outsider in his wife's world of corporate ambition had become someone who created his own world populated by people who shared his values and respected his contributions. It was a transformation that Coleman's attack had made possible, though certainly not in the way he'd intended. Sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the beginning of the best chapter of your life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.